Hi, welcome back. That was an interesting experience. It was really stressful, at least for me. Even I got lost. It's a pity that a lot of really nice alternative platforms are still a bit buggy, but hopefully showing them to you sparked your curiosity to use them. Uh, yeah, we would be happy to hear your experience about the tour via the chat. Um, and Margarita is also going to share an invite code for Lurk that Roel has sent her via the chat. So you can expect that. This was just the first part of the event, and the good news is the second part will be less stressful. Now we've experienced several alternatives for big tech technologies. It's interesting to think a bit further. Are such small, often open source based alternative platforms a way to fix the internet? Even the creator of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, said he wants to go back to the web that he had originally wanted, a web where individuals can have more power and control over their own private data. There are more and more of these initiatives popping up. It's becoming more common to do a micropayment to get content instead of getting content for free, for example. And there are also a few nice examples from young internet users trying to build a more positive internet future. We're heading towards a more decentralized internet without big mainstream platforms, but with smaller niche groups. Um, but would that be a good development, or does this kind of fragmentation cause new problems? In the online dossier that we published prior to this event, we highlight two ways of how we as users can take back control over the internet, how it is now. We can, on one hand, build our own new spaces. Developer and philosopher Jan-Hein Hoogstad told us about the read-write internet, where internet users consume, build, create, communicate, and negotiate together. And I visited the virtual office of Oye, a platform that is community driven and lets you design your own virtual hangouts. Um, Another approach is to hack existing platforms and use it in your own way. And that's what artist Soyoon Park is doing with her work. For our image contribution, she made a Korean makeup tutorial for TikTok that uses Google Translate. And Margarita also interviewed her for our dossier. It's definitely worth checking out. And the whole dossier actually, and Margarita will share a link to the dossier in the chat. Yeah, so what is the right balance to uh, between systems that are small scale, homemade, and sometimes flawed, as we've seen, and systems that are large scale and streamlined? So should we keep on using Google Docs because nothing can go wrong, or should we try out new things like this, EtherCalc or EtherPad? Are smaller alternative platforms really a solution? Should we reimagine the very infrastructure and the governance of the internet? This is something we're going to explore with the two upcoming speakers. The first, both will be giving a presentation of 15 minutes, and afterwards we have a panel discussion. If you have questions for them, you can leave them yeah, in the chat, and I will ask them during the panel discussion. The first speaker is assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science in Aalborg University in Denmark, EunJeong Cheon. And in the upcoming 15 minutes, she will show us that other tech is possible. Hi, EunJeong.
Hello. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
now?
yes, we can see you. Welcome to our event. We've asked you and both Niels, the speaker that will be next, to what's your favorite platform, and maybe we can have a look to your favorite platform at the moment. It's PubHub, right? Can
Yes.
you tell a bit more about PubHub?
The pop-up is actually developed by MIT and is kind of like alternative Google Doc. So you can actually collaborate something with others on text-based project or something like that. So I really like, and so far I really enjoyed, and I
Yeah.
think it's very stable at the same time. Um,
Is
so I highly recommend for everyone.
is everyone able to use it? Can
Yes,
everyone use it? Okay. Okay, good. I never heard about it, so it's good to know. Thanks for sharing. And if you're ready, we can start with your presentation.
sure.
Are you ready?
So first of all, yes, I'm ready. So shall we start? Um, yeah. First of all, yeah, thanks for introduction and thanks for having me today. I'm really delighted to be here and to talk about my recent work today. Very recently, with my wonderful collaborators, like you see in the slide, we published the report on defund big tech and refund community. In this report, we propose redirecting big tech's revenue flows to support community-based and community-oriented technology development and infrastructure that can better serve public interest. Today, my talk will be based on this report. If you're interested in text, you can find it online. You might have ever thought about how big tech makes its money, their billions. Despite a pandemic that shocked the entire economy, big tech is quite doing well. Amazon's Apple, Google, and Facebook rake in a huge amount of money since the pandemic. Here is a quote from Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO. In 2019, he said, "The only way I can see to deploy this much financial resource is by converting my Amazon's winnings into space travel." The comment shows the excessive wealth that he has acquired as Amazon CEO, and his enormous revenue would not be returned to a society and on Earth. Here we consider the harms produced by big tech, and we offer a better proposal for how we might collectively redeploy their enormous revenues in the service of earthly flourishing. Before I talk about why we need to defund big tech and how we can refund community, I'd like to explain about what defund and refund really means in this context. The Black Lives Matters movements in the United States provide important context here. We are inspired by the calls to defund the police in the US. And there has been quite debates regarding the funding of police departments. For example, questioning who is actually served by them and what forms of historical injustice are perpetuated by current institution of policing and incarceration. So the fund means to invite local and regional community to decide how to redirect the disproportionate funds now invested in enforcement and imprisonment to support alternative, more holistic forms of public safety infrastructure. So while we're not calling for the demise of big tech, we are calling for radical reform. Our proposal is to redirect big tech's accessible revenue flow we must transform the condition and funding structure that enable it and free up resources to develop digital infrastructure that better serve the public interest. I will begin with a review of the actual origins of big tech dominated technology infrastructures, as well as the harms that the existing system has brought. I will then discuss ways to defund big tech, sketching the roles that different actors may play. Finally, I will show how we might refund communities with the existing examples and possible visions. The origin myth of big tech is familiar to most of us. That is, risk seeking genius entrepreneurs start from nothing and pursue a novel idea. This includes from creation through commercialization and production to scale. According to the logic of this myth, they should reap the rewards. They created the value that generate the revenue. But very little of this familiar narrative is true. First, the big tech visionaries with technologies based on research at institutions that rely on significant public funding. It is the state, not private capital. The state has not only generated the conditions that make Silicon Valley possible, it has also financed the R&D and in many cases supported its product up to the point of commercialization. Almost every major technology that enables current digital infrastructures was created by nationally funded R&D long before the technology came to the market. For example, the internet itself and the smartphone. Second, decades of lobbying for deregulation have allowed technology like Apple to avoid paying back a share of their profits to the same states that funded much of their success. Finally, big tech companies are so highly profitable because they generate economic value at enormous scale. But who creates much of that value? Users. Facebook and Google sell their user profiles composed of content that was created by their users, not the companies. What has value in a user profile is the record of choices that user makes and the content that they create. These data become valuable assets for the platforms to sell to advertisers. In the case of Facebook, the company has secured a monopoly on the monetization of the value created by its users and prevents that from being shared more freely. So, what is the problem with all of this? In just a few decades, big tech has become part of the daily life of billions around the globe. But the social costs of this approach to digital infrastructure and services are far less visible. We could see two major problems here. First, the big tech are monopolists, positioning themselves as unavoidable gatekeepers in their respective areas. This market dominance has brought on multiple antitrust investigations by the US Congress and the EU. But the greatest threats are to democracy. They are among the most active lobbyists in the communication and electronics sectors, pushing the passage of laws in their favor or resisting those that are not. Big tech typically claim that any constraint on their actions would stifle innovation. However, their innovations are too often harmful. Big tech have systematically designed their services to be addictive, These practices often have contributed to people being subjected to political manipulation. Another disturbing result of big tech infrastructures is becoming the use of pervasive surveillance. Lastly, big tech companies undermine independent professional journalism. Typically, Google and Facebook refuse to underwrite the cost of producing the news content that attracts people to their platform. So the publishers got to rely on advertising business model that has serious consequence for independent journalism. I just haven't shown why we need to curtail the power of big tech. Now I'll talk about how their accessible power can then be redirected to community-oriented services. These changes will require initiative on the part of multiple actors, starting with big tech itself. For big tech, they should pay their fair share of taxes, and they stop secretive lobbying and other behind-the-scenes efforts to prevent regulation. It must be conducted in full public views. For governments and policymakers, they should revive antitrust laws to break up monopolies and reduce dependence of public institutions on big tech. Public institutions could leverage their collective power in order to develop their own services that are not controlled by big tech. For tech professionals, workers, researchers, and their organizations, they should educate technology students about the dangers of big tech and how to take responsibility for the system they develop. And they should support professionals worldwide who bring the tech abuses to light and encourage community tech. For civil society organizations and social movements, they should act as expert watchdog and a primary vehicle for effective mobilizing, pressuring corporations and governments into action, and should consider alternative to big tech platforms for communicating with supporters, organizing events, and publicizing issues. We as individuals should recognize that no computing comes without cost, even when offered for free. We need to consider a host of other hidden costs as well in terms of democracy, privacy, and other civil liberties and environmental sustainability. And we should resist big tech surveillance practices by using alternative, preferably open source services. You're currently using an alternative platform to watch my talk, so I think it's a good start. And you also just experience and learn about these wonderful alternative options too. Historically, community tech development well precedes the commercialization of the internet and the emergence of big tech. Until the mid 1990s, community tech was flourishing. So, community tech and developing alternative platform is a possible solution and also need to be revived. So for the rest of time, I introduce community-based tech initiative that contributes to reimagining digital infrastructures. One notable effort is deciding a free and open source system for a variety of participatory governance approaches. Ushahidi provides software and services to numerous sectors and civil society to help improve the bottom-up flow of information. Diaspora .org is a social media platform where you own your own data. Also, Decode project is developing tools that put individuals in control of whether they keep their personal data private or share it for the public good. The Decode project has been conducted in Amsterdam in 2017. As a concluding mark, just we know that major public institutions like school, libraries, and the post services that has contributed to public goods would not exist without significant, reliable public funding. We see alternative platform and civic tech in the digital era that efficiently produce analogous public common goods should receive comparable support. Thank you.
Thanks, EunJeong, for your presentation. It was super interesting. I think it's a really nice idea to say, okay, now, yeah, defund these big tech companies and let's invest in the community instead. And yeah, in your research paper that you wrote together with some other researchers, you list many important steps that we need to take to make that happen. And you also named some of them during your presentation, like the antitrust laws, or to educate technology students. But how are we going to make that happen? So you published the article, for instance. Did you take any further steps after publishing it, or what are you aiming for?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I position myself as a researcher who also have a responsibility to educate students who actually develop technology, and also I also another responsibility is kind of like support discourse around the big tech and their influence on society. So currently, with my collaborator, we are also plan to hold a workshop among our academic communities, researchers, so that we can get more support from our academic community, so that we can more um, strengthen our views on big tech
Yeah.
and their
Yeah, so after
influences.
the research paper, you are, yeah, taking this more practical actions to inform people about it. Interesting. If you have more questions for EunJeong, type them in the chat so I can ask them during the panel discussion. For now, it's time to announce the next speaker. So see you back later, EunJeong. Thanks again. The next speaker is postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, Niels den Oever. And with Niels' presentation, we will have a closer look to the architecture of the internet. Hi, Niels.
Hi.
Hey. You also brought your favorite platform.
For sure.
It's looking like this.
Yeah, it's Sotero.
Can you tell a bit more about it?
Well, as academics, we live, as you've seen from the excellent work from Professor Cheon, is we live with text. So we need to deal and manage with text, and we need to cite them. And if you've ever written a paper for school, you know that doing the bibliography is the worst. And actually, Sotero helps you to do that super easily, but it also keeps all your PDFs in one place and allows you to annotate them and save that in one place. So it's almost like your second brain of to be able to allow you to stand on the shoulders of the real giants.
Great. Now,
And
thanks
it's
for
open
sharing.
source
It's
and
open
free,
source, so everyone can use it.
self-hosted, federated. Nice.
Margarita will be sharing a link in the chat for the researchers among our viewers. Yeah, let's start with your presentation.
Let's go.
Yay.
So, hi all. Thanks so much that you're still here. I'm Niels ten Oever. I'm a researcher from the University of from Amsterdam. And today we talked about platforms, but I will argue that it's actually the infrastructure that produces these platforms and not just makes them possible. So the extractive practices of the platforms is a consequence of the structure of the infrastructure and continues to drive the development of the infrastructures in a particular extractive direction. Platforms are the fruits from the tree of infrastructure, but also the infrastructure in itself is an explication of power relations. And a power relation that, as I will talk in this talk, is shaped in a tug along two axes. One is between states and corporations, and the other one is intelligence in the network or at the edges. But let's go. So I'm Niels. I have done my PhD on internet governance, mostly work on the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, regional internet registries, and standardization bodies for the internet. A lot of abbreviations. But now I actually look more at how 5G is standardized and working. So both software and hardware hacking. And in my dissertation, I tried to research how norms get inscribed in these networks. So how the network ideologies take shape. And I'm very interested in power and global communication networks. So the first intercontinental communications network was a transatlantic cable that was laid already in 1865. People had worked on that for 3 years, and it worked for a total of 3 weeks with ever deteriorating quality. So the history of communication, and that's why today's session was so interesting, is actually a history of failures, actually more than it is of successes, because that's what allows us to iterate. And an example of that is that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Prince of Prussia wanted to communicate with the US president after his visit on his ship. But that was not possible, not because they did not use the right frequencies, but because the equipment used different standards and were patented and were from different makes. So a lot of the problems that we talk about today are no new problems whatsoever. And these communication networks are always and have always been proxies for power and are intrinsically linked with militarism and colonialism. The telegraph changed colonialism to imperialism by giving the centers of power in often Western European capitals direct access over much larger pieces of land. So the location of the center and the locus of power is gets more power through the removal of friction. This is a returning concept in communication networks to remove friction and thereby increase direct control. And this allows and determines the ability of decision makers in colonial environments to exert power in a topological empire that topographically might actually be very large and hard to imagine. So the history of global communications network is also a forgotten history. It's the forgotten women programmers, the forgotten female operators and maintainers, and the institutions that make the infrastructure work, invisible work. And infrastructure tends to hide itself. We take it for granted that it only shows itself to us when it does not do what it expected to do. But at the same time, it shapes our reality and sets the invisible rule for our everyday life. And infrastructure is inherently relational. So it's not just the stuff, the bits, but it's also the standards and the people that maintain it, as much as the physical infrastructure. The story of telecommunications and the internet is, of course, also one of institutions. And to ensure that the debacle of 1865 of the very expensive cable that only worked for 3 weeks was not repeated, the International Telegraph Union was established. And this is the oldest still functioning global governance bodies. It is the oldest body that is now become part of the United Nations, but the United Nations was only set up in 1947. So, but since then, the ITU has governed all communication networks, such as the telegraph, the telegram, the telephone, radio, TV, and radio spectrum. Until in October 1957, the Soviet Union launched an artificial satellite, and it emitted what Time magazine called those chilling beeps. The Americans were terrified, and so were people all over the world, because for the first time, everyone could hear beep, beep, beep. And no one knew what it meant, but it meant Soviet scientific superiority. And this led to the establishment of the Advanced Research Projects Agency in the United States. And this institute that would fund and develop the technology and networks that would later evolve into the internet. And this network had a different architecture than other networks. It was distributed, and it was that way so it could withstand a nuclear attack. Previous networks were circuit switched, needing a continuous connection. So imagine a continuous flow along a specific number of devices. It's very stable, but can deal very badly with interruptions. And you know this from when you're on a telephone conversation and the line is bad. Say, hey, yeah, did you hear? And it's very hard if you have one line to know what is lost. The ARPANET that has as design this criterion that needed to be able to withstand a nuclear strike, therefore was distributed and decentralized and made use of packet switching. So packets are the little parts of data, are little trucks that travel via way different ways through the network. And many of them get lost. Every day, the internet is a genocide of packets, but it doesn't matter. As long as one arrives at the end, the other computer knows how many, who is trying to send them what, and how many packets there are, and can request new ones to be sent. So in telecommunications networks, loss is not acceptable, but it's very much standard practice in the internet. So in telecommunications network and in circuit switching, the network is smart and the endpoints are dumb. Think of the initial touch dial telephones that only had 12 buttons. In packet switching, the endpoints are smart. Think of these excellent computers that could fill a room, but they were only connected via networks that would send data so people could access them from further away. And the network would just be dumb. In packet switching networks, networks only exist to transport packets and not to translate, hand over, or control. In telco networks, the networks are the locus of power. And the interesting thing is that telecommunication networks were always owned and standardized by states in Europe and colonial powers, or monopolies in the US. So already in early telecommunication networks, there was a tension between corporations and states. With the internet, where we saw these packet switch network, it brought about a shift where not every government had a vote, but not new standardizations came up, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, with its unofficial mission statement: "We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in a rough consensus and running code." And this was a direct sticked-up middle finger to the telecommunications standardization bodies, where only governments had an official vote. The internet and its institutions brought about a sense that the power of the nation-state was waning, and this fitted very much with the 90s Washington Consensus and Fukuyama's end of history. The Soviet Union, the maker of Sputnik, was beaten by the US, and the internet had won. The internet would bring freedom from tyranny by nation-states. Some scholars already then argued that it would just replace US military dominance over the world with US corporate power. Interestingly, we now seem to be almost at the end of that era. So submarine cables are now everywhere along the world, not just between Europe and the US. They connect the whole world. But if one looks at the shape of the data streams that go over them, one sees very different things. You see a complete reliance of the world on US data centers, but also an almost complete reliance of Africa data streams on Europe. And when you look more directly, you see this is almost one-on-one a replication of colonial power structures, such as in French-speaking Africa, it's Orange, etc. It's repeating and reinforcing extractive structures. But this also spurred the development of new technologies and rising world powers, such as China and Korea. Years these countries were told by the US and Europe that they should stop copying and develop their own patent portfolios. And now they did, in shaping 5G. So the early telecommunications networks like GSM were developed in Europe, the internet was developed in the US, and the most development in 5G in terms of patented technologies, contributions to standards bodies, is made by Chinese and Korean companies. But what is interesting is that where in the internet there was a layered approach, where different bodies would have only a small part of the cake, 5G tries to re-engineer significant parts of the whole stack. In 5G, the network becomes intelligent again through leveraging of concepts such as software-defined networking, network function virtualization, information-centric networking, and edge computing. The network becomes less transparent and is connecting to more devices that function more as sensors than as computers, so with more dumb endpoints. Computing increasingly happens in data centers and in the network, not on dedicated devices. For instance, think of Netflix and Spotify or Google Stadia. This makes the network omnipresent and opaque at the same time. With Wi-Fi, you can still choose which devices you can connect to your home router. But with embedded SIMs, so-called eSIMs, that are software-based SIM cards, many devices will be connected by default, and it will be nearly impossible for you to know which devices in your house are connected to the network and who has access to these devices. So there are two contesting regimes of state-aligned telecommunications corporations versus a very large American internet and platform industry. This is a very similar situation to the late 19th century, when in the US networks were dominated by an oligopoly of companies, and in Europe by states. This is a continuous tug between states and the private sector, and intelligence in the network and intelligence in the endpoint. We now had a few decades of privately owned networks with intelligence in the endpoints, and are now moving to more intelligent networks that are managed in alignment with the norms set by nation states. But what does this mean? That the problem might not be as technological as we think, or at least not only technological. This means we need to overcome technological determinism, and that solutions to the problems we have are ingrained in computing and networks, but cannot only be solved by changing the power imbalances that are reflected in technology. Technology should be a means of personal and societal reflection and emancipation. Technology and communication networks never exist by themselves. They represent societal powers and inequalities. Changes to networks and technologies therefore need to be grounded in intersectional analysis that needs economics, law, sociology, art, as well as philosophy and engineering. This should be the basis for re-envisaging networks that produce a world we want, not a world where the network is maximally optimized to serve you ads, extract personal data to centralized servers. Because one thing we learned, technological distribution does not protect against economic or institutional centralization. Actually, quite the opposite. If we want to limit the power of platforms, we need to re-envisage and rebuild the infrastructure to build an internet in the public interest. Not a machine for militarization, not an apparatus for policing, or an advertising device, nor an architecture of control. But we cannot wish power away. This means we need to build accountability into the institutions, the technologies, and the infrastructures as an inherent part of these processes and infrastructures. Thanks so much.
Thanks again. Thanks, Niels, for your presentation. It was really nice, and I learned a lot. And I also have a lot of questions. I start with one question from someone in the audience, which was funny. Jero, who asked, what kind of mechanical button is Niels hitting to advance to this next slide?
It's a mechanical keyboard with very clacky keys. Yeah, I love the tactility.
Mm-hmm.
This almost has to do with what Martijn talked about before about being in the terminal, but also in playing with hardware. Is often we try to take away friction, but I actually really like friction because it allows you to think and
Mm-hmm.
allows you to interrogate. And the more sleek interfaces are, the harder they are to actually know and understand. And when you take away the slick stuff, actually it is super mechanical and not that hard to understand at all. And then you see the labor and the people and the choices that are made that are often intentionally hidden.
Yeah, because I also have a question about um, that because some people say you need to know how to code to better understand how systems are built or to um,
So your question is it needed to code?
yeah or
No, it's just a way to ask questions. And as said, we need philosophers, artists, we need many ways to get us out of this mess. And we should not be technological determinists, right? But if you enjoy looking at it, code ethnography is a great way of doing it. But there is, and if I had a solution, I would tell you, but there is no solution. So I can also not tell you what we should be doing. So if you enjoy it, and I do so very much, you can dig into these networks and play with them. And when I was setting up my first 5G network, I was connecting my phone and printing my own SIM cards. It was engineering is fun, it's making things work, but it
yeah
also comes with great consequences. And I also don't want to be an armchair philosopher that just sits here with his fun books. But then again, we also need books to re-envision futures. And like this book is fun because we talk a lot about dystopias or about myths. And I really like Professor Chong's work about early internet imaginaries and how communities were involved in GeoCities, but before that on news groups and bulletin boards, where I also had my first experiences. Um, but then the internet was really going to change everything. And almost it has become dystopian. And it's great to be critical, but let's also say what we really want from it. And I really like Professor Chung's approach for communities, but I also really like this book, was called Fully Automated Luxury Communism, in which it tries to think how can we use computers to create a super positive future that we want, where it's not about whether we will watch the next movie in 8K, 12K, or we get smell from our devices, but how we can actually address inequalities, improve healthcare, etc. Right? Like real questions that really matter.
Yeah, maybe EunJeong can also come to the stream, and then we start the panel discussion. EunJeong, do you have a reaction to Niels, what Niels just said about that building communities is a good idea, but we also should imagine a future of the internet we want.
Yeah, I think definitely we should reimagine, the forthcoming, internet and technology environment. Um, sorry, what was your questions? I'm really
Yeah,
lost
I was
here.
just curious to as your first reaction to Neil's presentation, but you agree with what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
There are a few questions in the chat. One from Leo Loves. Niels, do you stay hopeful or aren't you hopeful?
Um, so I think it's a revolutionary obligation to be hopeful, and hope dies last. And it wasn't it Gramsci who said, "Pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will." And like this evening, we have been horsing around with technology, having fun, discussing, and I also don't think there is such a thing as utopia. That's why it's called utopia, right? And
Mhm.
we can never achieve it. And that's the thing also about human rights. It's a muscle that needs to be trained. You need it's always a process of getting there, but you'll never get there. But that is the arc of history of which we are part, and that we're trying to better. And in our era, it's a lot of this digital technology. Soon with quantum, it will be analog technology again. So it's like there's a lot of
Mhm.
exciting stuff and a lot of smart people thinking about these things. And actually, I find it quite exciting. Yeah, of course, you can get cynical, but what's the fun in that, right?
Yeah. Um, and let's see. Maybe a question for Young. Do you believe that the government should build digital public spaces? Should the government take a lead in that?
I don't think so because in the I'm not a history expert or any I'm not historian, but when we look back on the history of like some country the whose governments dominance the internet or technology is always it often tended to the control of their people or um so I think the giving power to government on developing technology, definitely there's like some harm. And I disagree with those
Yeah.
directions.
Yeah, and yes, we've seen with news presentation, it's like on one hand the control by the government, and on one hand control by corporate um, power for corporate organizations. And Niels, in your presentation, you also said we are at the end of the era of corporate power.
Of U.S. corporate power,
Mm.
you see that a lot of innovation is now being overtaken, and other countries are taking it serious. There's a lot of discussion about digital sovereignty, or for
What
better.
is that?
So there is in the European Commission has a new digital strategy, and one of the pillars is to achieve digital sovereignty. But as Professor Yu Hong argued in her book on networking China, he argues that that is also a very important for China to invest in these technologies to increase sovereignty and decrease reliability on the U.S. So the U.S. has overstretched for a while, and now you see the pushback against that. So, but how that will actually work and configure, and how these different technologies will be accommodated in different states, and how that will play out, that remains to be seen. That's why it's such an exciting time to work on policy and technology.
Yeah, yeah, that was one of the questions we got from someone in the audience was about the influence of China indeed. What your thoughts are on China's upcoming influence on the setting standards for technology and communications.
Yeah. So um, I'm of two minds. No, I'm of many different minds. A, remains to be seen. B, I don't speak Chinese, so uh, I'm just another white dude with a lot of opinions, and there are enough of those on the internet. Having said that, I'll give my opinion. The uh, uh, we have not seen China structurally weaken internet standards or build back doors in a similar way as the US and the UK have done in the past, right? But all the time are being said that China is a big security risk. So empirically, we have not seen that. There is no evidence of that. If you think about geopolitically, whether it's smart to be very dependent on one country, we can debate about that. That's why I think if we're going to, but this is a problem with telecommunications and patents in general. You can't learn telecommunication networks at university because it's almost all proprietary technology. So we first need to liberate that technology. And I think if we're going to auction spectrum, which is a public good, then we should demand that the technology on which that's done should be open and accessible, and then re-engage university and public uh, institutions in that discussion. So that should be the basis. But also we have seen, we know what's happening with the Uyghur people in China, and we've seen Huawei has also said that they are an inherent part of the strategies of the regime. We've seen their software for facial recognition to give terrorist alert based on Uyghur people. We see neural networks being trained on that. So that is super problematic, right? So, but I think
Mhm.
there's a difference between um, internal use and export of that. Even though some, it has also been Chinese telecom engineers have also supported some countries in Africa. I've done more work on this on the Funding Matters.tech website, but so I think we should caution every power, and we should also always fight for human rights, and we should take the means of production, which is the knowledge and the technology, and then try to build a commons on that.
Yeah. Another question we got from Mir, and maybe Eunjong, you can try to answer that. I'm wondering if you, first she thanks you both for the amazing presentations and the insightful debate. I'm wondering if you think that deregulation would be a solution to stimulate new initiatives, combat big tech lobbying, and facilitate new, more equitable infrastructures.
Um, Deregulation is often argued by big tech. Um, so I think it really depends on the context. So if we regulating, something for public goods, I think definitely, I think it's, good. But if such regulations allow big tech to do like something for for their companies over public good, I think definitely that would be
Yeah.
problematic.
I'm with Professor Chun, but
Mhm.
um, let's also unpack a bit what regulation is, right?
Mhm.
Regulation is nothing more than the rules we jointly set for how we fix things. And that's fine. I mean, like
Yeah.
if you run a household, if you need rules, you need to evaluate them, you need to change them based on the situation and the needs of everyone involved. But no rules is never a solution. But bad rules indeed need to be fixed and need to be adapted to the situation. And I think we've seen a lot of deregulation, and tech is also super smart. And
And
there
fast, and regulation is super slow often. That's.
yes and no. So
Mm.
Julia Power wrote an excellent book on this, about how law influences technology and technology influences law. So often it's also like a stone in the river, and the river flows a bit differently, and then it sediments there, and then you put a new stone. So it's both
Mm.
development. But if we've seen, you're totally right. It takes a long time. The generic data protection regulation, in Dutch known as the AVG, it took
Mhm.
15 years to develop,
Yeah.
but it's a big change, and it's also because it's done pretty good.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many of you people are in software development, but what Agile has done for the quality of code is the worst thing, because we're just trying to ship things and just tossing it out quickly. And that's not how we want to regulate. That's not how we want to do law. And actually, we humans have much more experience in making law than in code. So actually, maybe coders could learn a bit learning lawyers.
Yeah.
Code is like the operating system of our society. Law is like the operating system of our society. Right?
Yeah, that's the basis. Yeah.
Yeah, just want to add like one more thing to what Neil said, and also we have to think about how these technologies is really new. That is something that we haven't seen in the past. For example, like Uber. Currently, we don't have like any law for protecting Uber drivers. So big tech company really good at the making a law that protect their company, not their workers. So they have, because they have like a
Mm.
lot of like money to lobby governments and politicians. So um, I see the regulation is still slow to support the society, but I think all of this is because technology is like so fastly like developed, and then kind of showing the services and space that we haven't experienced in the past.
We got another question a bit earlier in the event for you, Eunjong, from someone called "The stream is your home" in our chat. What is this responsibility of the users in terms of defunding? Does the user defund by not using the platform?
I think just not using the big tech services technology could be just only one way. I think there's numerous ways we can actually do. For example, like supporting the organization who protest about governance or big tech surveillance. And the other way is just recognizing that what kind of like influence of big tech on society. And then the other way would be um, learning about the freedom of speech, communications, and those our human rights. I think learning about that and see how big tech actually constrained those the human rights. Um, so I think learning those influences and harms by big tech is definitely something as individuals can
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, we're already over time, and there is a lot still to discuss. But I think um, I'm going to ask my. You want to say something, Niels?
If I may add to
Yeah.
that, I think like abolition and refusal is one thing, but I also am not a proponent that we should all only use free software. We can also know our enemy and say what we like, but that we want it on other conditions, and that we want to be playful with it, and that we use it in different ways that they don't want or don't expect. So we should not. We should do resistance with joy, and really regain and also learn from those things, and not just say absolutely no, it's from Google, nothing can be good, because some things are better implemented by Google, and in our technologies we can learn from that, and then we can liberate it from those cases, right? So there have been excellent AI ethics researchers at Google, and I wouldn't want to just say you're bad. It would not be my choice, but we should consider it. And what is funny is that open source development and of the Linux kernel is largely done by corporations, right? So
Mhm.
let's not imagine that open source is coming out of is funded through a socialist utopia or something. It's our complex relationships, and it's about building accountability structures in institutions and deliberating about them. And there's this excellent book by the sociology and it says freedom is an endless meeting, and we
Mhm.
can't code ourselves out of this problem. We need to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so tonight was about alternative platforms, and I think also our experiment and our tour showed that, yeah, these alternative platforms are not ideal. As you said in your presentation, Niels, we're kind of uh, have a similarity with the history of communication because the history of communication was a history of failures. Um, I'm curious to what extent will such alternative platforms fix the internet, in your opinion, or will it be something that we will use next to other platforms?
Well,
How do you think about it?
it starts at being the side, and then it becomes the mainstream, and then that becomes the dominant repressive thing, and we want something else, something new, right? And there
Yeah.
is not, it cannot be fixed. You can also not fix your life. Well, I tried, but I failed, but I enjoy failing at it, right? We always live in beta. So I think we should continuing to exercise our liberties and our curiosity, and try to fight for the rights, especially of those who need them most, and express solidarity, be giving, be nice, and we should do it in all parts of our lives and also in technology. So
Yeah, so the fact that we don't like to use Facebook anymore, and there's much more and more criticism, is also a sign that we need to think about or see what's else. What
sure,
else is
Zainab Tufekci showed this, that those platforms also really helped very important movement
Yeah,
organize and
yeah,
give
of course.
support to people who are in psychological need. So I'm
Mhm.
not going to say to someone, you cannot use this because
No,
bad, but and so it's like, use it, but try to not completely become dependent, try to keep agency and change. And
okay.
Facebook, it's almost already gone, right? So
Mhm.
so not
So,
gone, but it is. So we're also moving on, and we should just also keep the faith.
and Young, what do you think? Do you think about these platforms? And do you believe, because Niels is saying keep the faith, you are quite positive, Niels. Um, do you also think, Eunjong, that we're heading to a different, yeah, we have to reimagine the internet and how we like it in a way ourselves?
Yeah, because I like to keep my the optimistic view on the future, but at the same time, I think to realize such alternative technology, uh, I think definitely multiple parties should put some effort to make that happen.
Mm, yeah,
So I think maybe as individual we can support um, politicians or party that support open source for community. I think we can support as individual, and then I think the civil organizations or researchers, school, they also something they can do for moving toward
yeah,
that alternative
yeah.
futures.
I,
And
um,
if
yeah, yeah, yeah.
fully agreed, is, and but the next big thing, of course, is climate change, and
Mm,
and e-waste, energy usage, but also like all the servers are built in California on the verge between two tectonic plates. It's like the worst place to build the backbone of an infrastructure, right?
mm,
So it's we have a lot of things to come up with, and now we see a lot of satellites being used. It seems to be a new development. But space travel is like, space also has always been intrinsically linked with militarism, and we should really see where we do our public, where we spend our money on, and what we're trying to achieve, and keep our politicians and decision makings, and also the funders, really accountable for what we want it to be funded for and under what conditions.
you're nodding Chen Yong. So we need to reimagine the future, but we also need a bit of help of the power structures around us to guide us there. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was both super interesting, and I learned a lot. And I think I would like to see your library news because I think you have a lot of interesting books to share with us. Um, yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We've come to the end of the event tonight. Um, Maybe you've become more hopeful about the internet, or you've been inspired to use one of the platforms that we've visited today. Feel free to leave any comments and feedback about tonight in the chat. Thanks, Niels and EunJeong, for sharing your interesting insights. Thanks to all the speakers, Roel, Aymeric, Carl, Michelle, Natasha, Leonike, and Martijn. Thank you for your patience and for your nice questions in the chat. Special thanks to the team because we really like organizing these tours over the internet, but channeling it in a good way is quite time consuming. So thanks, Marco, for all the technical help, and Margarita for thinking it all through. And of course, many thanks to AFK and Stimuleringsfonds to make this event financially possible. And not only this event actually, but our whole program for this year. We're really happy with your support. And there are great things coming up, actually. If you won't miss anything, please subscribe to yourself to our newsletter. You can also join our Telegram channel where we filter the internet for you. This Saturday, you will receive a list of links that we recommend to check out. Yeah, and we hope to see you at our next online event at the 28th of April. Besides an interesting program, we will also release a new online environment, so stay tuned. For now, it's time to say goodbye. It's a long evening already. Enjoy the rest of your evening and hope to see you soon. Bye.